Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 3. Hope everybody's doing well. Um, so, this week we're talking about presidential powers and the powers that are expressly given to the president in the Constitution in Article 2. We're also going to look at some of the implied powers that we hear discussed, like executive orders, for example. We hear in the news today quite a bit. I thought you guys did a good job on the discussion last week. I appreciate that. I saw some things I kind of liked. Like at the end of a couple of the discussion posts, there was somebody who actually came in and summarized what was going on in the discussion, which I thought was really cool. I hadn't seen that before. So if you guys want to keep doing that, that's great. Yeah, just make sure you're sticking with like 1 to 2 paragraphs, right? I'm not two would be ideal, but if you can give one good paragraph describing the question, especially with the question as complex and big as this one. So, but overall, I thought you guys did a really good job. Okay, so Article 2 of the Constitution, right, along with a few amendments that I had you guys look at as well, just so we could get sort of a constitutional scope of the executive branch and the office of the presidency, right? And I asked the question regarding powers, right? So, but obviously, Article 2 covers more than just powers, and we're going to talk about, sort of from here on out, we're going to be talking about more about the electoral process, right? And the Section 1 is talking about the process that the United States goes through to actually elect the president. Who knew it was such a Byzantine process? See, you actually thought when you went to vote you were voting for a candidate, but it turns out you're not even voting for a candidate. You're voting for an elector who chooses, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So it's pretty complex, and we're gonna talk about that. But after you get past sort of the the beginning stuff of how the president's chosen and what are the requirements of the president, you actually start getting into the presidential powers, right? So there are explicit powers that are given to the president, right? So the one explicit power, and this one I apologize, I should have told you guys to read Article 1, Section 9, I believe, which actually discusses the presidential veto, right? But that's one of the explicit powers given to the president, is the power to either sign or to veto legislation, right? So the president, they have, if Congress is in session, they have 10 days where they get a law sent to them. They have 10 days. They can either sign it or they can veto it, right? But if they haven't signed it and Congress is in session in 10 days, it's considered to become a law, right? Because the president hasn't exercised their right to veto it. But if Congress is not in session during that 10-day window, right? If Congress, if they adjourn and it's still within that 10-day window and the president doesn't sign it, then it's something called a pocket veto, right? So just sort of some interesting things about the actual veto, right? So generally speaking, the president's powers are primarily within foreign affairs, right? So the way that the framers of the Constitution designed it, the legislative branch had first of all, and this goes to our question about power, the legislative branch is the most powerful branch in the U.S. government, right? That's why it's divided into 2 houses, so it couldn't consolidate too much power, right? So at least from a constitutional perspective, the way that it was originally drawn up, the legislative branch, Congress, is the strongest. Right? So the president, in a lot of ways, and especially domestically, a lot of the powers that the president has are actually reactive to what Congress does. Right? So it's like a punch counter punch kind of thing, right? Or go with the flow. But in foreign affairs, it's very different. Right? In foreign affairs, the president actually has a lot of power. So we know that the president is the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy, and he also is the commander of the National Guard, right? In times of crisis or emergency, the president can mobilize the state units of the National Guard, right? So that's a power, that's perhaps the first power we think of when we think about the president, right? Is being the commander-in-chief of the military. Now, what exactly that means and what that entails is kind of up for grabs, right? Because we've had a history of presidents actually waging war without Congress actually making an official declaration of war, right? So the last official declaration of war in American history was World War II, right? Well, let's see, we've had Korea, We've had Vietnam, we've had Desert Storm, we've had Operation Iraqi Freedom, we've had Operation Enduring, and the list goes on, right? And none of that stuff has happened with the Congressional Declaration of War, right? So that led to something called the War Powers Act, which came out around the time of Vietnam to make sure that the president wasn't actually abusing their powers as commander-in-chief, right? Because that means that I believe it's 60 days, right? They have 60 days where they can actually carry out military actions without congressional approval. But after that 60 days, Congress has to approve it, or they have to actually, call back the operation, right? So it's tricky, right? Because day in and day out, there are lots of military decisions that have to be made that are not just, requiring a declaration of war, right? I mean, there are all these thousands of daily decisions that go on within the military that the president has to make the final say on, right? So regarding the question of whether the president actually has too much power or not regarding the military it's debatable, right? But we need somebody, especially in times of emergency, which is something we'll talk about with implied powers. We need somebody who can make a decision quick, right? Let's say that somebody actually, a country invaded the United States, right? And we were under fire and the country was being taken over. We need somebody who can actually step up and take those executive actions, right? Like Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Paper number 7, he was arguing that we have the need for this energetic, that's what he called it, energetic executive who can step in and actually take these actions, rather than Congress having to deliberate about it. Okay, so that's one thing, right? The president is the commander-in-chief. So we've got the president's got the sword, right? One thing to remember is Congress has the purse and the president has the sword, right? So those are two sort of rough ways of thinking about the way that the powers actually break down. But in addition to being the commander-in-chief, you could also say that the president is the diplomat-in-chief, right? Because the president appoints the ambassadors, right? And the president is the one who entertains dignitaries and foreign heads of state, right? So in addition to actually wielding the sword, you could say that perhaps the president also wields the olive branch, right? And if you look at the presidential seal, by the way, in one claw of the eagle, it has the arrows, and in the other, it has the olive branch, right? So something, and ironically, interestingly enough, which hand the arrows and the olive branch are in actually change depending upon whether we're in a time of war or a time of peace, right? So they have a rug in the Oval Office, and one side has the arrows in the right claw and the olive branch in the left, and the other vice versa, and they just flip it around depending on whether we're at war or not. So just an interesting little piece of trivia. Okay, so let's see what else. Right, so this is an interesting one, and this is sort of the basis for the implied power of making executive orders, right? So it says that the president can request in writing the opinion of the ministers or the leaders of the executive agencies that are helping him actually carry out the law, right? Because you have to remember that domestically speaking, that is the president's purview. Congress makes the laws, and the executive branch makes sure that those laws are actually executed, put into place. Right? That's why it's called the executive branch. And the president has the authority, right, to create these agencies that he or she believe will help them actually carry out those laws. So that's why we have this thing called the federal bureaucracy, right, which is all the agencies and all the departments and all the centers and all this sort of stuff that have sort of evolved organically over the past couple hundred years to help the president actually carry out the laws that have been put into place. So here's where things get tricky from a domestic perspective, because it says in the Constitution that the president can request, in writing this opinion, right? So essentially, what that is saying is that the head of all of these different agencies and all these different departments essentially report to the president, right? The president is the person who directs the federal bureaucracy for most part. So before the president even takes office, he has 7,000 appointments to make. So the president has to appoint 7,000 new people before he even enters into it. He or she, I'm going to get that right in a minute, he or she actually takes office, right? And the vast majority of those, are, especially the vast majority of the executive positions, right, are subject to Senate confirmation, right, the consent of the Senate. But anyway, the way executive orders actually work is it's just like the president is the CEO of a company, right? And you have a new CEO who comes into your particular business, and they decide they don't like the way that some particular unit within that business is doing things. The CEO issues a rule or creates a regulation or policy or something like that. And that's essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about an executive order, right? It's a rule, it's a regulation, it's a policy created by the president to adjust or make sure that a particular action is being carried out the way that he or she thinks it should be carried out to enforce the law, to execute the law. And that's what an executive order is. Executive orders, they do carry the weight of the law to all the federal agencies that fall underneath the president, right? The executive branch. And that's important because with things like immigration, immigration and customs falls under the Department of Homeland Security, who falls under the president, right? So that's how executive orders actually work, and that's why they're so important, because these are the people who are actually going out and enforcing these laws and enforcing these policies. So that's why executive orders and executive action are such a controversial topic, because in a way it's like the president is legislating without actually making a law. Right? Now, the thing to know about executive orders is that they are subject to judicial review and interpretation. So if the president issues an executive order and somebody challenges that order as being unconstitutional and it takes it to the Supreme Court can overturn that executive order. Similarly, Congress can pass a law that contradicts that particular executive order, and that law will trump that particular executive order. Right? So there are checks and balances once again with executive orders. So, all right, let's see what else. He or she, the president, can convene or adjourn Congress, right? In extraordinary circumstances. 9/11 happened, something like that. Congress is not in session. The president can call Congress back into session. If there's a particular contentious debate going on in Congress, the president can adjourn Congress. The president has the power to pardon, right, or commute sentences. So, this thing about signing, vetoing legislation, getting an opinion in writing from the cabinet, that's something else that I should say. The cabinet is actually an implied thing. There is no mention of a cabinet in the Constitution. That's something that George Washington started. Department of State, Department of Defense, Department of the Treasury. And it's just been sort of a precedent since Washington did that. Every other president has just kind of followed suit with their closest advisors, which become the cabinet, right? But now it's a more official thing. All those things can be done just based on the president's authority, based on the president's decision, right? The pardoning is not contingent upon Senate consent. Convening, adjourning Congress obviously is not. Requesting opinion from the department heads is not. Commander-in-chief is not. Signing, vetoing legislation. Those are all single actions that the president can take on their own authority. There are some joint powers that are given that are subject to congressional approval that are mentioned in the Constitution. The one is making treaties, right? The president can make treaties with other countries, but it has to be approved by a 2/3 majority by the Senate, right? Most of the appointments that the president makes are contingent upon approval by the Senate. It just takes a majority. It's just simple consent. Consent just means majority in Congress, right? And this is something that's interesting and tricky, is that if Congress is not in session, the president can make temporary appointments, right, during that particular time period where Congress is actually not in session to maybe the Secretary of State or something. If they actually, if something happened in the Secretary of State and Congress wasn't in session, the president could temporarily appoint a new Secretary of State. We talked about executive orders. The president is responsible for preparing the federal budget, although, once again, that has to be approved by Congress, right? Executive privilege is another implied power. That is not something that is ever stated in the Constitution, but George Washington, once again, set the precedent when Congress requested information regarding John Jay and some documentation that he had written for regarding Great Britain. Washington essentially said, "I'm going to, not make this information public." Right? Essentially, executive privilege just means that with certain correspondence that is a matter of national security or national importance, the president can declare executive privilege and keep that information from Congress or keep it from the Supreme Court. Right now, this is up for, once again, this is something that's up for judicial interpretation. The Supreme Court could say no, because it's not written into the Constitution. The Supreme Court could say no, you need to give that information, right? So it's not something that's written in stone necessarily. Emergency powers, that's something else, right? A lot of people will argue that there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the president has special powers in a time of emergency, other than this notion that the president can convene Congress if there's an emergency, right? But some people argue that because the president can act quicker and the president doesn't have to, go through the legislative process that Congress has to go through, it's sort of implied that it's the president's job in the case of an emergency to step up and actually take on more power. Right? This is what Lincoln did during the Civil War when he suspended habeas corpus. Right? It's what Roosevelt did in World War II in the Great Depression when he expanded presidential powers. He was called the imperial president. Right? It was called the imperial presidency because it was like he was essentially becoming an emperor, because the powers of the executive branch expanded so much during that time because there was a time of crisis. Right? And that's an important principle to think about when we're thinking about presidential power today versus presidential power as it was written in the Constitution. It seems that every time there is a crisis in American history, the executive branch, through this emergency implied power, takes on a little bit more authority. And what we know is that usually when somebody takes on extra authority, they don't give it back. Right? So this authority keeps accruing through time as we, World War I, World War II, the Civil War, all these things happen, right? And the executive branch, because it has this emergency sort of implied power, tends to take on more power, and they have retained, the majority of that power. Something else that, I guess this is the last thing I'll say for today regarding this particular question, is the reality versus the perception of presidential power. Right? Even in some of the discussion posts I was reading from you guys, people, would say that it's the president's job to run the country. Well, no, not really. I mean, if you can find anywhere in the Constitution where it says it's the job of the president to run the country, I'd be surprised. Right? That it doesn't say that. Right? And in fact, the president, especially domestically, the president is supposed to be sort of a counterweight to Congress, right? So it's not the driving power. But there's that perception, right? The president is sort of the spokesperson. Teddy Roosevelt called it the bully pulpit, right? You have this big megaphone, right? And this is how you shape, American and the world's perception of the United States, both domestic and foreign perceptions. Right? Because you have the microphone, you have the loudest voice. There's no question that the majority of cameras, the majority of reporters, all these things focus on the president. Right? The president, whether it's constitutional or not, the president is certainly the most powerful political force in Washington, D.C., therefore the most powerful political force in the United States. Right? Maybe outside of the people, we'd like to think. But the perception and the reality are actually quite different. But in politics, oftentimes perception is reality, right? So even if it's not explicitly written in the Constitution, the president wields enormous power because of the spotlight that is shined upon that person, and they are looked at as sort of the leader, the person who runs the country. But actually, they're not, right? If you look in the Constitution, you will see that that is not what is written in the Constitution. So we have a question of perception versus reality, right? So the perception is certainly that the president is the person that runs the country, and the perception is that the president is the most powerful force in politics. But the reality is, at least domestically, that the most powerful force, perhaps not the most powerful single individual, but the most powerful force in American politics and American government is the Congress, right? So we have this sort of counterbalance going on. Anyway, couple of final comments. Crap, what was I going to say? I completely forgot what I was going to say. So one thing I was going to say was that I have gone into your discussions and I've read through all those discussions and I made some comments, right? So just look through those when you get a chance and see my comments. And if you have any questions based on what I say, just go ahead and respond, and I'll definitely check those, and I'll respond to your comments. And I can't remember what my other comment was going to be, so I'll save it for next time. I'm going to post our discussion question tomorrow, right? So I'll probably post it tomorrow afternoon. So just be on the lookout for that and respond to that within 24 hours like you did last time, and respond to a classmate